In the middle of a dusty Texas summer, under the relentless sun, the local livestock auction was buzzing with noise and impatience. Old men leaned against railings, spitting tobacco, while young buyers checked their phones, waiting for the next big horse to be brought out. Everyone came for one reason: to spot a future champion, a horse that could win races or breed legends. But not him. At the far end of the crowd stood Daniel Brooks, a broke rancher whose boots had more holes than his wallet had dollars. His small ranch was barely hanging on, his debts were stacked high, and his last few cattle had been sold just to keep the lights on for another month. Daniel wasn't there to buy glory, he was there chasing a miracle. When the auctioneer shouted, "Next up, lot 52, a 2-year-old mare, smallest of her herd, barely 15 hands," the crowd chuckled. The mare was thin, her ribs visible, her head lowered like she already knew her worth in their eyes. Someone yelled, "That thing won't pull a cart, let alone win a race." The laughter rippled through the barn. Daniel didn't laugh. Something in the horse's eyes stopped him cold, a quiet fire, a determination he'd seen before. It was the same look his father used to have before every storm that nearly destroyed their ranch. That look of silent defiance. The bidding started at $500. Nobody raised a hand. Then $300. Still silence. The auctioneer sighed, ready to move on. Daniel hesitated, his hands trembling. He had only $400 left to his name. That was supposed to feed him for 2 weeks. But his gut screamed louder than logic. $350, he shouted. The crowd turned, half amused, half pitying. "The broke rancher's losing his mind," someone whispered. The hammer came down. Sold. As Daniel led the small mare out of the ring, people laughed again. "Enjoy your lawn ornament," one man sneered. But Daniel didn't look back. He didn't know how or why, but something told him his life had just changed. Daniel's truck rattled down the long dirt road to his ranch, the trailer behind him echoing with the nervous steps of the little mare. Dust rose in the sunset light, turning everything golden, except his thoughts. He had just spent his last $350 on what everyone called a lost cause. He didn't know whether to feel brave or stupid. When he opened the trailer, the mare hesitated. Her legs were trembling, her coat dull from neglect. She looked like she'd been through too many cold nights and too few full meals. But when her hooves touched the dry earth of Daniel's ranch, something changed. Her ears perked up. Her eyes, those same eyes that caught his heart at the auction, scanned her new surroundings. Daniel smiled softly. "Welcome home, little one," he whispered. "We'll figure this out together." He named her Grace. Not because she looked graceful, but because he believed only grace, a kind of divine mercy, could save him now. The first weeks were hard. Grace wouldn't eat much. She was skittish, jumping at every sound. Daniel spent his mornings fixing fences and his evenings brushing her mane, talking to her as if she were his last friend on earth. Sometimes he'd laugh, sometimes he'd cry, but every night, before heading back into his empty farmhouse, he'd pat her neck and say, "One day, they'll all see." Neighbors stopped by and shook their heads. "That horse'll never run," Dan, one said. "She's too small. Too fragile." Daniel just smiled. "Maybe," he'd reply. "But sometimes the smallest things carry the biggest hearts." Then, one morning, something unexpected happened. Daniel woke to the sound of pounding hooves. He rushed outside, thinking Grace had escaped. Instead, he saw her racing across the field, not weak, not trembling, but powerful, alive, free. Her mane whipped in the wind like a flag of defiance. That sight lit something in Daniel. He called his friend Marvin, a retired trainer who once coached racing horses before losing everything to bad investments. "Marv," Daniel said, "I need your help. I think this little mare might be special." Marvin laughed through the phone. "Special? Or suicidal? You can't train a runt to be a racer, Dan." "Then come see her," Daniel said quietly. "If I'm wrong, I'll never bother you again." 2 days later, Marvin drove up in his old pickup, expecting to waste an afternoon humoring a desperate man. But when Grace trotted out of the barn, something in the old trainer's eyes changed. "She's small," he murmured, "but, her gait, look at that symmetry." He squinted, following her movements. "She's fast." Daniel smiled. "I told you." They laughed. They all laughed. "But Grace, she's got something." Marvin stood silently for a long moment, then finally nodded. "All right, Dan. Let's see if your miracle horse can run." Training Grace wasn't easy. She wasn't built like the sleek, muscular racehorses everyone admired. Her legs were shorter, her body leaner, and she tired faster than the rest. But what she lacked in strength, she made up for with heart. Every time she fell, she got back up. Every time Marvin said enough for today, she pawed the dirt, begging for one more run. The morning started before sunrise. Daniel would brew black coffee in the silence of dawn, watching fog roll over the fields. Grace would already be awake, waiting near the gate, ears perked, ready. Marvin would arrive grumbling about crazy ranchers and impossible dreams, but Daniel could see the spark in his old friend's eyes, the spark of a man who had found purpose again. They trained for weeks, then months. Grace learned to sprint, to respond to Daniel's voice, to cut corners like lightning. She didn't have the power to outrun the biggest horses yet, but she had rhythm, and an uncanny instinct to anticipate the finish line. One day, Marvin leaned on the fence, watching Grace thunder across the pasture. "You know, Dan," he said slowly, "I think we might actually have something here." Daniel smiled, sweat dripping down his face. "I told you." She just needed someone to believe in her. The first local race they entered was small, a charity event in a nearby town. The crowd laughed when Grace trotted onto the track. Compared to the towering stallions beside her, she looked like a child's pony. Someone in the stands yelled, "She won't even make it halfway." Daniel ignored them. He patted Grace's neck. "You've got nothing to prove, girl. Just run your race." The bell rang. At first, Grace fell behind. Her stride was shorter, her pace uncertain. The audience lost interest, turning to chat among themselves. But halfway through, something shifted. Grace's eyes locked on the lead horse, and she exploded forward. Every muscle fired, every ounce of energy poured into motion. She didn't just run, she flew. By the final turn, the crowd was on its feet. The laughter turned into gasps. The tiny mare passed one horse, then another, and crossed the finish line third. Not first. But not last. For a horse no one believed in, it was a miracle. After the race, a journalist approached Daniel. "She's incredible," he said. "What's her name again?" "Grace," Daniel answered proudly. "Because that's what saved us both." From that day on, whispers began to spread in the small-town racing circles. "That little mare from Brooks Ranch? She can move." Marvin grinned one evening as they watched Grace graze. "You realize, Dan, if we train her right, she could make you rich." Daniel chuckled. "I don't care about rich, Marv. I just want to prove that heart beats pedigree every time." But fate had bigger plans, and Grace was just getting started. Within a year, Grace had gone from being the joke of the auction barn to the quiet talk of the racing world. Her name started appearing in local newspapers. "Tiny mare stuns crowd again, underdog horse challenges champions." And each headline brought new visitors to Daniel's dusty ranch. People came out of curiosity, expecting to see a miracle or a myth. What they saw instead was a humble man and his small horse, working harder than anyone else on the track. Grace wasn't winning every race yet, but every time she ran, she improved, faster starts, tighter turns, stronger finishes. By her 5th race, she took 2nd place, shocking everyone. By her 7th, she won, beating horses worth 20 times her auction price. The crowd went wild. Cameras flashed. Marvin nearly cried as he hugged Daniel. "You did it, Dan." "She did it." You just beat horses bred for royalty. Daniel smiled through the tears. No, Marv. She just ran like she was born to prove him wrong. Word spread fast. Trainers and investors from other states started calling, offering sponsorships, training deals, and money. Real money. One man even offered Daniel $500,000 for Grace. That was more than he'd ever seen in his life. But Daniel shook his head. She's not for sale, he said. You can't put a price on a soul that saved you. The months rolled by, and the bond between Daniel and Grace deepened. He would sleep in the stable before big races, brushing her mane, whispering old country songs his mother used to sing. Grace would nuzzle his shoulder, as if she understood every word. Then came the big one, the Western Derby, a regional event with national attention and a $2 million prize. Everyone told Daniel he was crazy to enter. She's not ready, Marvin warned. You'll ruin her if you push too hard. Daniel stared out at the field one evening, Grace grazing quietly beside him. I just want her to have her moment, he said softly. Win or lose, I owe her that. When race day arrived, the stands were packed. Television crews lined the fences. Grace stood at the starting gate, smaller than every other horse, but calmer, steadier. Daniel could barely breathe. The starter raised his flag. Bang. They bolted. At first, Grace fell behind, again. The crowd sighed. Commentators murmured that her size couldn't match the power of the giants ahead. But halfway through the race, the same spark appeared in her eyes. Daniel leaned over the rail, whispering, Come on, Grace, show them. And she did. She surged forward like lightning, slipping through gaps between horses, moving with impossible precision. The crowd began to roar. By the final turn, Grace was neck and neck with the favorite, a $3 million stallion named Titan's Reign. The finish line loomed. The two horses thundered forward, side by side. And then, by a single nose, Grace crossed first. The stadium exploded. The announcer's voice cracked, Grace wins the Western Derby. Daniel dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face. The mare that no one wanted had just beaten the best in the country. But this was only the beginning. That victory would lead to something even greater, and a fortune Daniel never imagined possible. After that legendary win, nothing was the same again. Grace became a national sensation overnight. Newspapers called her the Miracle Mare. TV shows wanted interviews with Daniel. Sponsors flooded in with offers, feed companies, boot brands, even a luxury pickup manufacturer. Everyone wanted their name attached to the story of the man who bought the smallest horse and turned her into a champion. But Daniel stayed the same. He still lived in the same old ranch house with the creaky floors and the peeling paint. When journalists asked why he hadn't moved to a mansion or bought new cars, he simply smiled and said, Grace doesn't care about marble floors, she likes dirt. Still, the money started pouring in. Grace's winnings crossed $10 million in less than a year. But that was just the beginning. Her bloodline, her DNA, the very genes that made her small yet unstoppable, caught the attention of the biggest breeding operations in America. One morning, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, holding a contract worth $20 million for breeding rights. Marvin was across from him, mouth half open, staring. Dan, this is life-changing, he whispered. You could retire today. Daniel chuckled softly. I don't want to retire, Marv. I want to keep her legacy alive. But I'll take this, not for me, for the ranch. For the next dream. They signed the deal. Grace's story spread internationally. Magazines in Europe and Asia wrote about her as the horse that redefined possibility. A movie studio even called, wanting to make a film about Daniel and Grace's journey. But behind all the glamour, Daniel never forgot where he started. Every time he saw Grace in the paddock, he remembered that day at the auction, the laughter, the whispers, the disbelief. He often whispered back to her, we showed them, didn't we? Then came an unexpected offer from a wealthy sheik in Dubai. He wanted Grace's foals, and he was willing to pay $40 million for a long-term breeding partnership. Daniel couldn't believe it. The man who once had just $400 to his name now held the pen to sign a multimillion-dollar deal that could secure generations of his family's future. When he signed, the cameras flashed. But Daniel didn't smile for the money, he smiled for the journey. Reporters later asked him, "How did you know she was special?" Daniel looked at them for a moment, then replied quietly, "I didn't. I just refused to believe she wasn't." From that moment, Grace became more than a racing legend, she became a symbol. Her story was taught in business schools, shared on motivational stages, and told to children across the country as proof that sometimes, greatness comes in the smallest packages. Daniel turned his ranch into a sanctuary for unwanted horses, naming it Grace Haven. Every horse that came through the gates carried a piece of her spirit. Proof that the world's laughter can't stop a heart that refuses to give up. And when Daniel walked out each morning, coffee in hand, and saw the sun rising over the fields, he'd see Grace's offspring running free, strong, proud, and unstoppable, just like their mother. He'd smile and whisper to the wind, "Everyone laughed when I bought that tiny mare, but she made me 40 million times richer, in more ways than they'll ever understand." After the $40 million deal, Daniel's name was everywhere, magazines, news programs, even morning talk shows. But fame never sat comfortably on his shoulders. He wasn't a man who cared about the spotlight. He cared about the quiet mornings, the smell of hay, and the sound of Grace breathing in her stall. Still, the world wanted more of the miracle mare. Reporters came to his ranch from all over the globe, from Italy, Japan, Brazil, all asking the same question, "What's your secret?" Daniel always gave the same humble answer, "There's no secret. I just believed when no one else did." But fame brings pressure. Grace's next races carried massive expectations. Sponsors wanted victories, headlines, glory. Daniel just wanted her safe. "She's not a machine," he told Marvin one night. "She's done enough for me. If she never runs again, I'd still call her my greatest win." Marvin nodded. "But you know the world won't stop asking." So Grace ran a few more races, and she won them all. Not with ease, but with heart. The crowds chanted her name, children held signs that said "Run, Grace, run," and every finish line became a moment of pure emotion. Daniel would stand at the fence, hand over his heart, tears welling every time. Then one day, after a triumphant race in Kentucky, Daniel noticed something off. Grace was limping slightly. "Nothing serious," the vet said, "just fatigue." But to Daniel, it was enough. He decided, right then and there, to retire her. When he made the announcement, the media went silent for a moment. Then applause broke out. Even in retirement, Grace had one last victory, she left on her own terms, undefeated in spirit. The night she came home for good, Daniel opened the barn door and saw her standing proudly, bathed in moonlight. He walked over, resting his forehead against hers. "You don't owe me another thing, girl," he whispered. "You gave me back my life." Outside, the wind rustled through the fields. It wasn't the sound of applause or money or fame, just peace. The kind of peace only those who fought their way through storms can understand. In the weeks that followed, letters started pouring in. People wrote from all over the world, single mothers, small business owners, struggling artists, all saying the same thing, "Grace's story gave me hope." Daniel kept every letter. He stacked them in boxes by the window. Sometimes, when he felt lonely, he'd open one at random and read. That's when he realized Grace's greatest victory wasn't on the racetrack, it was in the hearts she touched. Grace's retirement didn't mark an ending, it was the start of something even greater. Months passed, and while the world moved on to new champions, Grace's name never faded. Breeders called her a phenomenon. Scientists analyzed her bloodline. But to Daniel, she was still just Grace, the small mare who changed his life forever. Then, one spring morning, the ranch came alive with new sounds. In the soft light of dawn, Grace gave birth to her first foal, a tiny, chestnut-colored filly with bright eyes and impossibly strong legs. Daniel watched in awe as the newborn tried to stand, trembling but determined. He smiled through tears. "Just like your mama," he whispered. "You're gonna be something special." He named her Faith. From that moment, everything changed again. Grace's foals began to inherit her fire, her willpower, and her uncanny intelligence. Within a few years, her offspring were racing, and winning, across the country. Newspapers now wrote Faith, daughter of Grace, takes the crown, and the legend grew even bigger. Soon, Daniel's modest ranch became a symbol of second chances. He transformed it into a sanctuary called Grace Haven, a place where broken horses and struggling people could find purpose again. He hired young trainers who'd been fired elsewhere, veterans who'd lost their spark, and kids who'd never believed they could work with animals. Every morning, he'd walk among the stables, tipping his hat as the horses neighed in greeting. "Morning, Grace," he'd whisper to the mare who started it all, now grazing peacefully under the oak tree. "You did good, girl. Look what you built." Grace Haven became famous not just for breeding champions, but for healing souls. Families visited from all over to see the miracle horse and her foals. There were murals of her on the barn walls, and a bronze statue by the entrance, Grace in full stride, mane flowing, eyes fierce. Marvin, now older and slower, would sit on the porch every evening with Daniel. "You know," he said one night, watching the sun dip below the fields, "this place, it's more than a ranch. It's a reminder that no one is too small to make a difference." Daniel nodded. "That's what Grace taught me. Sometimes you just need one creature, one heart, that refuses to give up." As the years passed, Grace's story spread beyond borders. Documentaries, books, and speeches kept her memory alive. She became a global symbol of resilience, the living proof that faith, heart, and stubborn belief can outshine wealth, power, or pedigree. And through it all, Daniel remained humble. He never forgot the laughter at that dusty auction house. He'd often tell visitors, with a soft smile, "They all laughed when I bought her. I don't blame them." But sometimes, the best stories start with a laugh. Years rolled by like gentle waves. Seasons changed, the ranch grew greener, and Grace, the little mare who once stood forgotten at an auction, grew older. Her coat turned silver around the muzzle, her movements slower, but her spirit never faded. She still lifted her head proudly every morning when Daniel stepped out of the farmhouse. He'd bring her an apple, pat her neck, and say, "Morning, old girl. The world still remembers you." Visitors still came, families, reporters, children clutching notebooks. Grace had become a living legend, and standing before her felt, to many, like touching history itself. Daniel would always stand nearby, smiling quietly, watching the awe in people's eyes. But one cold winter morning, Daniel noticed something different. Grace didn't come trotting over to greet him. She just stood by the fence, gazing out toward the hills. Her breathing was slow, her eyes gentle but distant. He walked up and placed his hand against her warm neck. "It's all right," he whispered. "You've done more than enough." That night, Grace lay down in her stall, surrounded by soft straw and the quiet hum of the ranch she'd built. Daniel sat beside her, his weathered hand resting on her mane, tears quietly falling. She lifted her head one last time and pressed her muzzle against his shoulder, a silent thank you, before closing her eyes forever. The ranch was silent the next morning. Word spread quickly. Messages flooded in from around the world, "The miracle mare has passed." People held vigils, shared her story again, and thanked her for the hope she'd given them. Daniel buried her beneath the old oak tree at the heart of Grace Haven, the same tree she'd always rested under during summer afternoons. A small wooden plaque marked the spot, "Grace, the horse that believed." He visited her grave every morning after that. He didn't cry anymore. He just smiled. Because he knew. Her spirit still lived in every horse that ran across those fields, in every person who walked through the ranch gates, looking for a second chance. Months later, a journalist came to interview him for a special feature titled "The Legacy of Grace." During the final question, she asked softly, "If you could go back to that auction day, knowing the laughter, the struggle, the years ahead, would you still buy her? Daniel's eyes glistened. He looked toward the oak tree and whispered, every single time. The journalist smiled through tears. And what did she teach you? Daniel's voice cracked as he answered, she taught me that sometimes the smallest miracle can change your whole world, if you have the courage to believe when nobody else does. As the camera faded out, the wind rustled through the leaves of the oak tree. And for a brief moment, it almost sounded like the echo of hooves, the spirit of Grace, running free forever. The legend of Grace didn't end with her passing, it only grew stronger. Years later, documentaries, books, and even a film were made about the small mare who changed one man's destiny. But what audiences remembered most wasn't just the races, or the fortune, or the fame. It was the quiet power of believing when the world laughs at you. Daniel Brooks lived many more years at Grace Haven, surrounded by the generations of horses that carried Grace's bloodline, fast, fierce, and free. Every morning, he still woke before dawn, coffee in hand, walking toward the oak tree where she rested. The ranch hands often saw him standing there, talking softly as the first light touched the fields. He didn't talk about money. He didn't talk about success. He talked about gratitude. Thank you, girl, he'd whisper. For showing me that miracles don't always come wrapped in gold. Sometimes they come with mud on their hooves and fire in their eyes. When Daniel himself passed away quietly in his sleep years later, he was buried right beside her. The two who had changed each other's lives, man and mare, side by side forever, under the same oak tree that had witnessed everything. Visitors still come to Grace Haven from all around the world. They walk between the fields, read the sign that says, "Believe in small beginnings," and feel something stir in their hearts. Parents tell their children, that's where the horse that nobody wanted became a champion. And every time the wind sweeps through the tall grass, the locals say you can hear it, the faint rhythm of hooves, as if Grace is still running across the open fields, her spirit reminding everyone that faith and courage can rewrite even the cruelest of fates. Everyone laughed when he bought that tiny mare, but she didn't just make him $40 million richer. She made him believe again. She made the world believe.